There are many things that I am excited and hopeful for in the coming year. One of those is the Episcopal Church in Colorado being a part of a pilot project produced by the Episcopal Preaching Foundation and Trinity Church Wall Street on elevating and equipping lay preachers. I'm excited about this prospect and what it will mean for our church. And in that vein, I want to share with you one of the best lay preachers I know. I happen to be married to him, and Mark is going to offer his gift in this sermon for the first Sunday after Christmas.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through the Word. And without the Word, not one thing came into being. What came into being was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's only Son, full of truth and grace. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be holy and acceptable unto you, O Lord, our rock and our salvation. Amen. We are at a unique place in our liturgical calendar. It's the Sunday after Christmas. And most things in the liturgical calendar vary by year. There's year A, year B, year C. Except every year, if you look under this Sunday, it will be all years. We always read this gospel lesson. And I have to admit, I've struggled with this passage for years, especially since I took a class at Wake Forest University with a professor named Charles Talbert on John. And I've struggled with how this has been translated and how it's been understood, because the key word in this, the word, logos, can be translated a whole lot of different ways. And it's a very popular term among Greek philosophers of the time, both before and right after Jesus' time. This word could be translated logic, logos, the root of our word logic. It could be translated reason. It could be translated speech, or it could be translated dialogue. It could be translated discourse. Even some philosophical circles, it was used for the cosmos and as a creative force. When Jerome translated this into Latin for the Vulgate, he was unhappy with translating it as word and instead used the Latin word verbum, which of course is the root for our verb. He wanted to connote the action that was embedded in the Greek meaning. Luther later just translated as das Wort, the word. And that's been the dominant translation in Protestant circles since then. But I always think that translating it as just the word and the big theological meaning that has garnered through Luther and Calvin and Barth, etc., that this word misses something very important in what John is really after. I mean, clearly, John is giving us one of our first Christian attempts at articulating what Trinity is about. It's one of our first Christian attempts to really understand how can we worship one true God and still see this Jesus that we follow as something more than just a prophet or just a human on earth. So, if you'll indulge me a moment, I'd like to offer my own translation or my own paraphrase of this passage. In the beginning was the conversation, and the conversation was with God, and the conversation was God. And the conversation was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through that conversation. And without the conversation, not one thing came into being. What came into being in that conversation was life. And the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. And the conversation became embodied and lived, conversed among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's only Son, full of truth and grace. I think this sense of conversation or dialogue, this give and take, better captures what John was really after, our evangelist John, when he writes this passage. I don't think I really ever even had an inkling of what it meant to follow a Trinitarian God, what that could possibly mean until in seminary I read a book by an author named Elizabeth Johnson. The book was called She Who Is. And the powerful part of that was Johnson captures that the Trinitarian formula isn't about math. It isn't about the importance of 3 and 1. It's about understanding God as wholly relational and wholly unique. It is about understanding that being itself is relational. That God is relational within God's own self. And that so when God chose to create, God is extending that selfness, that piece of God, that being, that life into all of creation. It is to understand that God is both the one true God, utterly unique, and still in relationship at the same time. Now, we as humans, that's more complex for us because sometimes we want to be fully unique. We're like teenagers who want to differentiate from our parents. At the same time, we want our parents' approval. There's a disunity, a disjunction there. So sometimes we want to be fully unique, but we want to be in relationship with others. And we find ourselves sometimes feeling either alone or just caught in the crowd. But for God, there is never this disjunction. God is always fully unique and fully in relationship. And God invites us from the very moment of creation into dialogue, into relationship with God. Now, conversation is an important part of relationship. In fact, I dare say if you think about who the people you would say are close friends, it's people you talk with either frequently or very deeply when you do talk. And I have those experiences, right? I mean, Kim and I try to set aside date night, even in COVID-19 times. We try to set aside date night apart from our children and just have that time to be able to talk one-on-one with each other. I have a friend who we've been friends since we were 10 years old. We've been really close since we were 13. We roomed together for 3 years at college. His name's Carl. Carl's a really good friend. And we don't see each other very often. And to be honest, we don't even talk that often. But when we do, it always feels like we just picked up right where we left off. In fact, I was talking to him just the other day. He was driving somewhere. And he said, "Okay, Mark, I'm just going to have to get off the phone now. Because if I don't get off now, I'm going to need to pull over on the side of the road and we'll probably talk for another 2 hours." Every time we talk, we just re-engage because we're close. But those conversations are part of how we became close. Conversation gives us a way to understand what God really meant, what God really does in creation. God does not need creation. God creates out of love, out of extending a relationship. God is always already full in relationship in God's own self. That's what we mean by the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. But God chooses to create. God extends God's self to us through creation. Now, we are not God, but we are in relationship with God. That is what it is to be creation, to be created. And conversation becomes a way for us to understand this very incarnational moment. That's what our evangelist John is talking about here. That God loved us so much that God not only created us, but when we were so arrogant as to turn away from God and say, we do not need to talk with you, we do not need to be in relationship with you, God came to us in a whole new way. I had a business with a business partner, and he and I sold this business to a company that's in Miami. And it was founded by a Cuban American exile. And one day I was walking into the office in the middle of a conversation. And the conversation was taking place in Spanish. The chairman of the board was there, the CEO was there, they were both sons of the founders. My boss was there, who's a what they call Peter Pan, right? He fled Castro when he was but a child. And I walked into the room and they were having a conversation in Spanish. And mid-sentence, Jose, the CEO, mid-sentence, he switched into English. And it was both incredibly humbling and incredibly respectful, because he switched immediately when I walked in the room so that I would be included in the conversation. And I thought of that today as I was reading this passage. That's what God does for us in the incarnation story. God shifts to a different language. God shifts to the language of flesh and blood. God shifts to the language of embodiment and living in creation to better converse with us. And that metaphor of conversation becomes a powerful way for us to understand the importance of our worship. For worship is that place where we dialogue with God and with each other, where we share with God and with each other. It becomes a way of understanding prayer as a continuing dialogue, a kind of literal dialogue with God, not because God needs us to talk to God, but because we need to talk with God. It becomes a powerful way of understanding what it means to come to the Eucharistic table, that it is a continuation of the conversation. It is a special way of God being present to us. And it is also a way to understand that if we are lax or unable to do any one of the things, we have other ways to continue to converse with God. Understanding God creating conversation and God coming to us in conversation is a way of us understanding what we usually call as evangelism. It's a way of us understanding that part of our calling is to invite others into the conversation that we understand and or we are having. And it is to understand how we relate to God in a sense of justice. For justice is knowing that we love God so much that we're always looking around to see who has been excluded from the conversation, who has not had a voice, who has not been allowed a voice in the conversation. And it compels us to help those without the voice find that voice and begin to participate fully in the conversation. And conversation allows us, this dialogue with God allows us a small window to understand what this incarnation is all about, what the Christmas story is all about. Christmas as conversation, because God loved us so much that God came and dwelt among us. My father died about this time of year 6 years ago. About 3 weeks before he died, he was dying of cancer. He'd had a long, hard battle. And about 3 weeks before he died, I went and stayed the week with him. And we both knew that that was probably the last time that I was going to see him alive. We both knew that that was the last time we were really going to get to talk. And by talk, at that point, he had lost his vocal cords. Cancer had taken most of his throat. So he would write what he wanted to say, and I would answer back. And he would write, and I'd answer back. And in one of those conversations, he said that he really wanted me to know that he thought picking a life partner was one of the most important decisions we ever make, and that if we choose to have a life partner, it's very important who we pick. And I agreed with him. And yes, I think that's very important. And then he wrote back and said that he felt like his children had all chosen well. That was really touching to me because, to be honest, when I first brought Kim home to meet my parents, they were not thrilled that I brought home a black woman. When we told them that we were going to get married, they asked all the questions you might expect. Well, what about the children? You know, marriage is hard enough and you'll get a lot of additional grief from other people. And those things are true. We do have times, we've had times where we've had additional grief from other people. But I realized when I was thinking about my dad that what he understood was, I think, what John is after in this passage. When my father said that he felt like I had chosen well, it was a great affirmation of the relationship that he built with Kim over the years. But I laughed and said, Dad, I'm not sure I get credit for that because in a lot of ways, Kim chose me. I'm the lucky one here. And I realized that that's what John the Evangelist is trying to tell us. The Christmas story is this. The story of Jesus is this. The incarnational story is this. God chooses us. God chooses us in creating us, and then God chooses us again by living and dwelling among us and preaching among us and healing among us and then dying on a cross and rising again. Incarnation, that baby Jesus in a manger, is about God restarting the conversation again. God choosing us. And one more time, saying to us, come.